Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Invisible Activity. We're a homegrown podcast based out of the Compound Yellow Artist Space in Oak Park, Illinois. Our mission is to put independent artists, community projects, and art spaces on the radar so that their causes and ideas can reach others through the airwaves of the internet. We like to focus on people creating art and community projects at the vanguard of social change. These makers, leaders, and artists are making waves within their local groups, and now they have a chance to reach you in your own home. Today, we're going to dive into the realm of relational aesthetics. We're going to see where the boundary between artist and spectator is blurred, and where the medium for an aesthetic experience is not a material product, but rather the interaction between people. Artist and curator Marianne Bernstein will be joining me today to talk about her project, the Nomadic Cube. Part installation, part art space, part curatorial practice, the Nomadic Cube is an ambulatory structure used to bring artists and communities together in spaces where class division melts away. Her medium is not the structure itself, but rather the relationships between the people who interact within it. Often going into difficult, liminal spaces, Marianne's Nomadic Cube brings attention to what is possible when a space is created to incite collaboration and union between people who have not otherwise met or interacted. Links to her website and sources will be in the video description. And while you're here, you can make sure that you check our website and follow us on social media. And we're recording, so welcome to Invisible Activity Podcast. It's good to have you here.
Thanks.
So let's get started. So you have in Compound Yellow the piece that you call the Nomadic Cube. Can you describe in your own words what the Nomadic Cube is, how it came to be as a concept, what inspired the idea of using a cube as a space demarcation for community building and performative art? Can you tell us about the story behind it?
Sure. First of all, thanks for inviting me on your podcast. It's great. It's great. Let's see where to begin about the cube. I think it kind of can be traced back to my childhood if you want to go way back. And I think a lot of our creative practices can be traced to what we loved to do as kids. So for my childhood, I grew up in a large family and we had a house in the city, and then in the summer we would go to this farm where my siblings and I would just wander freely. You know, it was those days when there weren't supervised activities, and there were 6 kids in our family. So my parents just figured, you know what, they'll just like put us on a farm and we can spend our summers that way. So a lot of my childhood was, free creative play. We roamed around our farm. I made forts with my sisters. We had a club in a tree house. We were always finding spaces to play in. And then my mother, who didn't believe in toys, bought us what we called a playhouse. Basically, it was just a open cube structure with a little table that came down or up. One side was a chalkboard. And my sisters and I and some of our neighborhood friends spent maybe a couple years playing with that playhouse. And we did all kinds of things, fashion shows, stores, space travel. The sky was the limit. And, I really appreciate that my mother kind of invested in that sort of play instead of buying us. I don't remember having any kind of a plastic toy or Barbie or anything like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's a whole philosophy behind that.
Yeah. So I was very lucky that way in the sense that, I came from a big family, but we were always encouraged, especially the older ones, when we were growing up, really encouraged to just find things to do on our own.
Yeah.
And just go out and roam and have fun. So
yeah.
I think those were very formative years for me. Mm-hmm. And I also, being in a big family, I tended to love. At one point, I shared a room with my sister, and then at another point, I wanted my own room. I had this little room that was just for myself. And I realized early on that I was the kind of person that needed to be solitary in a big family, needed to have a little space for solitude so that I could really feel good about moving out into the big group and being with the dynamic that was our huge family.
Kind of recharge your social battery and everything like that.
Right, but it was sort of this idea, it wasn't conscious, but that I really needed solitude, and I really enjoyed being with other people. So the cube has that. You're sort of enclosed in a space, and you also are part of a bigger dynamic. So you have this sort of sense of being enclosed, at least in the initial cubes, and then yet it's very public. So that was kind of a metaphor for my childhood, sort of moving in, moving out, moving in, moving out. And then later, I found that I really loved cross-pollinating into different mediums. I always loved being a photographer. That was sort of my natural first love. But I also gravitated towards writing, towards theater, film. I think because my family, like my dad, was really interested in that. I used to watch him make films with a 60mm camera. They had lots of artistic friends, so I would meet sculptors and painters, and I was exposed to that from a very young age.
So kind of like your mom sort of took you away from like the toys that sort of like feed your imagination with these like fast stories or fast or fast food quality imagination tales and all that, and instead exposed you to artists, creators, makers, and then put you in an open field without really the stimulation to take the your imagination to an already preset mode, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because we didn't have toys like Barbies or whatever, I didn't really grow up with this notion of how I was supposed to look, or to look like Barbie, or my mother didn't wear makeup. Yeah. So I really credit my parents, both of them, each in their own way. My father was really kind of very much of a poetic, still is, poetic soul, almost turning 100 soon, actually.
Really?
Made a very huge impact on our family in terms of just his love of the arts and music, and my mother too, but especially my father. So later on, I did gravitate towards lots of different mediums. In college, I was directing theater, I made films, I was writing, I was also involved in, social justice issues, working in a jail, working in a heroin clinic, kind of always using creative methods wherever I went. Even when I was working, as a social activist, I was always using workshops, creative workshops, theater workshops, as my way of kind of trying to understand issues that were, out of my present experience. I always kind of want to expand that and just learn.
Yeah. Okay. What films were you making when you were making and producing films?
Well, I made one large film that was a little later. We're going to jump around, but the film that I made later was a film I made with a friend of mine, Judy Gellis, who recently passed away from brain aneurysm, tragically. But she had this idea of making a film about Jewish American veterans from World War II, about how they experienced anti-Semitism in the U.S. Army, the same way that, Blacks did, and how later it sensitized them to understand segregation and to march, during the civil rights movements, that their own experience in the Army with anti-Semitism really sensitized them to the plight of Blacks in America. And often they became very involved in protests.
It was like a documentary style.
It was a documentary style. It actually won a lot of awards. It went to about, 15 different film festivals.
Ooh,
and it was called From Philadelphia to the Front. And we found 6 Philadelphia guys. They were all really different, told their stories, and then found really amazing footage in the archives. So this was a perfect example of me wanting to jump into an arena where I knew nothing. I really did not have a lot of experience, but it was something that I felt like was worth just diving into, and the same for Judy, really. And we just kind of learned as we went. We were a really good team, and I kind of done that a lot, I think, with all the different kinds of practices, just wanting to explore a medium, usually around the social justice issue, and just jumping in and just, learning as you go.
Reminds me of an advice that John Waters would give to budding film students. That was find a news headline that you just found today in the newspaper and make an entire film about that piece in 24 hours, and sort of just jump into it. Don't really do research prior. Just learn as you go and make the film your own school about the issue or the news piece or whatever. That
Right.
is kind of like a way for strengthening the imagination, or trying to force the brain to work around the problems of conceptualizing something and putting it into a film, you know?
Exactly. I mean, I think because of my interest in theater, I really have always loved this idea of improv. And you do that when you don't really know what you're doing. You're kind of improving because you're making it up as you go along. And I have
Yeah,
found that,
that's like 75% of this podcast.
but I mean, that's why it's so good because
Yeah,
it's fresh, right? I think
yeah,
that a lot of times when you don't really know what you're doing, but you trust your intuition, and you're working with other people who you respect and other creative people, and you kind of all sort of hold each other accountable and encourage each other. I think that a lot of really interesting things happen organically. And that sort of takes me back to your question about the cube too, that this the cube is a vehicle for that kind of activity. It's multidisciplinary. There's
hmm
a lot of cross fertilization. Anything can happen in the cube. If you whatever you dream, you dream it, you can do it. And that the beauty of it is often a lot of times you don't even really know what's going to happen as it evolves. And I find that much more interesting than having a definite plan.
right, right. So that's how it plays kind of into your filmmaking, your theater, your writing. That plays into the ideas of the nomadic cube to sort of create a space where a multidisciplinary exchange of ideas can take place, and even create new mediums, like new hybrid mediums of like film and performance. You've mentioned that you even screen movies or screen films, or recorded media onto the cube. Can you go into a little bit of that?
Sure. Before I do, I just wanted to just add that, in the late 90s and, up until about 2000, I was living in New Haven, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I was the head of the Visual Arts Committee at ArtSpace. And they were about to lose their building because it was a time where the arts money in the arts was drying up. They had this huge building they couldn't
Right.
afford it. And so I didn't want to see that organization go down. And I was also involved in curating shows in there. And I found the white cube to be a little confining. And so there were starting to be conversations all around about how can we get beyond the white cube like they did in the 70s, sort of bringing back sort of the idea of alternative spaces.
Yeah.
So, I think at that point I was not having gone to art school and just sort of finding my way intuitively through all of this. I just started doing all kinds of things that felt like they'd be interesting. So I invited my good friend Lynn Myers, who's a painter, into the window of ArtSpace, and she was painting on site with people walking by. And
Yeah.
then I started to just take a lot more risks and push my own comfort zone, and then started my own alternative space called Untitled Space, and gathered about 10 artists to work together kind of as a family. So I found that this way of working, often in abandoned storefronts, we kind of moved around, from storefront to storefront.
Yeah.
I found myself feeling much more wild and free.
Mhm.
That there was, it was personally, I was kind of in a midlife crisis, asking myself, who am I? Who am I as a, woman, artist, mother, wife? And so I was trying to break free of constraints that I found, artistic constraints, and other things that I found were holding me back, and just challenging them and sort of being a rebel. And so that time was a really important time for me because it really pointed me towards a much more collaborative, inclusive, and participatory model of being in the world, and not trying to control the outcome or stay on script, and letting life evolve. And those artists that I hung out with in the 90s, it was Aaron Michelin and Matt Austin, Sharon Curl. It was like a theatrical ensemble. And so that experience was very pivotal in terms of coming up with the idea of the cube
Mm.
later, which was, how can we create art and expand it out to the wider community in a way
Yeah.
that's, much more enriching. And even the NEA, finally in 2000, they published this report about that art needed to be more accessible to the public, and
Yeah.
that artists needed to venture out and find a more interdisciplinary practice. But that was already later. We were already doing it in the 90s before it was actually kind of a thing. So, and as far as the films, the idea of the films on the exterior of the cube was to not just have the cube be this open cube, which people had done before, but sort of take it one step further and film what actually happened inside. And then and this started in Love Park, which I can talk about, but at the end of each day, we wrapped the cube in Love Park and we projected what had happened that day. And that was kind of this really cool new way of having cube function in a dual manner, one live performance, the other allowing people in the community to come and actually watch themselves and realize they're part of this art piece.
When there's no one in the cube, and for our audience, I mean, it's just a cube made of aluminum, right, or stainless steel?
Right. Aluminum, yeah.
Yeah, aluminum, and it's just a reddish pink, bars of aluminum, and it makes a 10 by 10 cube, and it kind of looks like a minimalist piece from the 1960s. But then it sort of becomes the stage for all this, relational artwork that happens inside the space of it. It's kind of like as if the Black Mountain School just became a relational art practice, and just said, hey, we're just going to make a gallery out of a cube, and we're just going to film what happens inside it, whatever happens, and art world standards be damned. Let's just put raw life on the scene, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it becomes kind of like a theatrical set. Like it is a proscenium of sorts, right?
Yeah.
And, when you're inside, you're looking out, and the theater is life. And when you're outside looking in, that's also life. So it's sort of like either you're in or you're out. It's still all one life. And, the cube just kind of frames it, or the onlookers kind of look at it and see life framed and can look at things maybe in a fresh new way. It has changed its forms over time. I mean, right now it's about as minimal as you can get, because I wanted it this is the 5th iteration, the current one. I wanted it to travel and be as lightweight as possible. It almost looks like nothing.
Yeah.
And that's intentional.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks like one of those statues or sculptures that you would see in the Beacon or the Glenstone Museum or something like that. Something that belongs in like a wide field of different statues coming together. But this leads into one of the questions that I had for you, that, what have the other versions of the Nomadic Cube been like? Because you have mentioned in our conversations prior to this that you did go to Philadelphia, and you did have this empty lot that was in a place that was being unused, and there was kind of like this specific issue in the Philadelphia community that you wanted to address. Do you see the Nomadic Cube traveling and addressing specific issues, or do you see it as a general or all-purpose piece that fits into whatever condition or situation that it's in?
Right. Well, maybe I can just quickly outline the different iterations of the cube and show, what they've done. So the first cube was in Love Park, Philadelphia, and it was called The Welcome House. And it came about, I was working on this exhibition called Shelter, and I was thinking about, what does shelter really mean? And soon afterwards, I realized I wanted to kind of make a shelter of sorts in Love Park, because it was the heart of the city and a problematic space because they had kicked the skateboarders out. So the homeless were hanging out there. No one wanted to walk through it. It was right near City Hall.
Yeah.
And a woman had been murdered there in broad daylight. And so the initial idea for the Love Park Cube, it started actually is that I was going to make a house, sort of thinking of this shelter show that I've been curating. And so I first went to Home Depot and saw like a garden shed. At first I was going to just put a garden shed in the middle of Love Park and just sit in there and kind of do stuff in there. And then, but I met this architect, Darren Edwards, at Interface Studios in Philadelphia, and I was telling him about this idea. And I was thinking I should really work with an architect to, actually build something interesting. And so he and I talked it over, and then at one point he just sketched out a cube, and it was sort of this eureka moment, like, yeah, that's much better than a Home Depot, garden shed.
Yeah.
So we worked together to design the cube, and it really was sort of a massive, it was kind of like a house. It was a cube, but it was also kind of like a house. It was pretty massive. And that particular installation was in Love Park during Design Philadelphia. It was there for 10 days. And what happened there was really extraordinary. We made friends with the homeless guys who were in the park and got to know them pretty well. They were really interested in what we were doing, and we involved them in opening up in the morning and explaining to people what it was. And then there were 10 artists who I curated into the Cube daily, and they were each doing different kinds of things, but they were all doing work that involved, it was all site specific. They were all doing work that involved the place. Like one of the women there was plexi on this particular cube. She was drawing what she saw from the inside. So if there was a person standing there, she drew that person. She was drawing the park. And so in the end, it was just sort of this massive drawing on the plexi of what she saw that day. And it was wonderful. And so we filmed her. She was one of the videos projected on the cube. There were a lot of different artists and different things that happened in there. But what happened gradually, because we were able to be there for 10 days, all day and all night almost, we really were embedded there in a very meaningful way. And then at the end, when we had the Design Philadelphia party, they were thinking maybe they should rope out the homeless people in the park. And I said, no way. They are the project. They are the welcome.
That's something that, that's something that a lot of places like, for example, Art Basel in Miami or these big art fairs always get a lot of criticism for, because they do have to sort of quote unquote like get rid of the undesirable people, quote unquote, and they sort of end up doing something that's kind of like a war crime, just evacuating homeless people.
Exactly, or making it. Yes. So we turned that upside down. Yeah. And it's really great what happened, because, my son was a rock and roll drummer at the time. And I just remember he was always putting people on the guest list. And that was really special. Like if you're on the guest list, to come sit in the back of the show, or, come in ahead of the line or whatever, get into the show first. So because I knew that he used to do that with the shows, I realized what I wanted to do was certainly involve our friends in the park. And, there were concerns about them drinking. So I thought, all right, what we can do, we were just thinking creatively, like, we'll just put their name on the guest list. And that would be the tip off to the people at the bar, that they just could have just one drink, not to overserve them, And so I went over and I took everybody's names and I said, you're on the guest list, you're invited. And they went back to the shelter and they showered and they came back dressed up to the party. And, one of them said, how do I look? Should I just mingle? And what happened that night was really extraordinary. I mean, it was almost maybe even more important than what actually had happened in the cube during the day. And what happened was that we broke down a lot of barriers that had been there. And you had Design Philadelphia people, young hipsters, we had live music, and there's this video on my website where you can watch it and you just see everybody dancing together under the stars, having a great time. And, for that moment, everything was just really magical. And so that is what really got me to keep going, just, in search of those moments where people, you realize you actually have made a difference,
Yeah. And that actually reminds me of this ancient Roman tradition of the holiday called Saturnalia, which was this holiday in which the class system in Rome's social hierarchy was dissolved temporarily, and slaves, poor people, rich people, citizens, immigrants, prisoners, they all just dissolved their boundaries, and for a few days. Everybody ate at the same table. Nobody was a different caste than anybody else, and it was kind of like this beautiful moment of freedom. I mean, and too bad that a few days would pass, and then unfortunately people would just go back to being the same stratified society. But it does remind me of this tradition in Rome. But it's I think this is an example of how your piece is a good space for bringing out social change, something that we're looking at, in this podcast, that the art, that the relational aesthetic of this, of the nomadic cube is for the purpose of dissolving boundaries between people.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. It can feel like it's temporary. I guess like any beautiful moment in life, you can have this sort of pinnacle moment and then, it sort of dissipates. I remember this scene in a Fellini movie where everybody is going to this funeral and everyone's honking and, they're Italians and arguing and yelling, and then all of a sudden it starts to rain, like in the middle of this funeral service, and everybody just gets quiet, and there's like this hushed moment that's really beautiful. And then it's over. I think the rain stops and everybody just goes back to yelling and leaving in their cars.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that is, if there's any one thing that motivates me, probably in anything that I do, it is that search for just these moments where we just are one, that the differences fall away. Like you were saying, that sounds like never heard that about this Roman tradition, but yeah. And I think that artists can do that each in their own way sometimes. And certainly when you're working in the social sphere, if you come in without too much, if you surrender to the situation, there's always that possibility, even briefly, where you can do that. And then the ripple effect can be far and wide. Like in Love Park, all of Love Park changed after we left. It completely changed. And this has been true, I'm proud to say, actually, with all the cubes, wherever they have been, because often they're in difficult spaces, not right now, but in the past, I've chosen difficult spaces. They've all had a major impact on the spaces that they have been. And you can't really explain it. It's just, that's just what happens sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Plato in the Treatise of the Republic sort of shamed artists and poets as being as distorting reality and taking what's already pure and true and distorting it. But I think that what you're saying is just an example of how art can actually be that necessary counterpoint in society against the status quo, where you have the status quo of stratified society that just happens when you have cultures that are specialized or people specialize in roles, or there's a system of money as the currency or whatever. And it becomes a counterpoint, and it becomes the dissolving agent for a lot of these boundaries. And it sort of works right now as the counterbalance to the normal, what we call normal,
Right.
Yeah.
So true, because I think, a lot of prejudice is based on just really not interfacing with someone who's different from you. So I know in a lot of my projects, I have purposefully thrown myself into situations where, neighborhoods I wouldn't normally have been in, situations I wouldn't normally have been in, brought people together, even people who with different practices, writers, doctors, putting people together who wouldn't normally interface, because it's so important for people to dialogue and be together face to face.
Yeah, and it's really weird because we do have a lot of space of different types of buildings and infrastructures. We have libraries, schools, museums, parks, a lot of spaces that have different functions. You go to learn at the library, you go to look at art in the museum, you go to the supermarket to buy food or whatever, but there's no sort of infrastructure that's made for dissolving boundaries. It's always, and it would be very interesting to see sort of, or theorize, or sort of have these political metaphysics where you see ideas of infrastructure that is designed for the sole purpose of dissolving boundaries between castes, between classes, between people of different groups, and then they can sort of meet at a point where their differences melt away, and like you said, they become one, or the space allows for a certain coming of opposites to meet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that's happened, it can happen in so many ways. When I was curating a show, this is kind of jumping ahead, but when I was curating a show a few years ago at the Delaware Contemporary, one of my international projects, Due South, about Sicily, and we can touch on this when we're talking about institutions, but I had found that the board there was very sort of closed-minded about doing an international show. They just wanted to show Delaware artists initially. I wasn't from Delaware. They had kind of a very small-minded approach, which has actually changed a lot, but at the time. And so, one of the things I could have just been I was really taken aback when I first presented, because I thought they'd be really excited about this international show. And they did finally agree. But the way that I was able to get through to them was to actually involve them in the process. And then I brought many of them to Sicily with us right before the show occurred. And that changed everything, because we were traveling with them. they got to go on this amazing trip. They got to have
Yeah.
these experiences. So I guess I've learned that, what's that saying? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer,
Yeah.
or, I mean, I think it's just true right now. There's such divisiveness, and it's so easy to just polarize and not agree or not understand how someone else thinks. And I just think it's so important to bring people together and just, have a kind of a dialogue in a safe space. Like if
Yeah.
people don't, it's got to be in some sort of a safe space. That's what I have found, where the really dramatic change can take place.
And by safe space, you obviously you don't mean where everybody has the same opinion, but rather a
Right.
space where different opinions can come in and
Exactly.
counter each other and change each other without having it become a violent interaction.
Exactly, which is
Yeah.
what I hope I like to think of the cube that way also, that you're entering the safe space in a way that all experiences and all different kinds, everyone is welcome.
Yeah, and you mentioned in our talks with Laura and the other people at Compound Yellow that you are naturally gravitating towards community-run galleries and artist-run art spaces. Is this partly why you want to go into these spaces rather than mainstream galleries, or do you feel like mainstream galleries fail to provide the this context that your artwork needs to get what you want, this space where ideas can meld together?
Yeah, I remember reading a little while ago, there was this book called The Empathic Civilization by Jeremy Rifkin, and he was investigating the evolution of empathy. And he was talking about how recent scientific studies show that we're wired for collaboration, and, that our natural impulse is to get along with each other, which, started with cavemen, then to our state and country, religion, to the planet at large. That's our natural state. But when we're prevented from engaging with other people in a meaningful way, like the best parts of ourselves get repressed. And this is kind of where you get narcissism, fear, anger, violence, whatever. But when we see each other see ourselves in each other, harmony often ensues. That we have this innate, most humans have this innate desire to thrive. And so I have found, maybe because I came to working with art institutions late in the game, I didn't go to art school. I was a writer, I was an English major, I was doing all these other things, that by the time I got to art space in the 90s, I saw what wasn't working about an institution, which was, that most people I was working with had gone to art school. They had very specific ideas about how to have a show, how to hang a show. And for a time that was good, but like all ideas, I feel like, you have to keep moving. You can't, if you stay stagnant with the ways you were taught or with certain ideas, and maybe at a time they were radical, but then they're really old. And so to me, even though I loved and I learned a lot from curating some shows there, I kind of still curated my own way because I didn't know any better. And I gravitated right away out of the white cube onto the streets doing that kind of thing. And I think that's just partly that's me, partly because I love that kind of interaction. I love being around other creative people and other artists, and having that be my life. And I would sit in board meetings at the art gallery and I would have all these ideas about what I was thinking about and what I wanted the museum to be. And they would save me for the end and hardly get to the ideas. So I went and I did them on my own, and they thrived. And then when the museum almost closed, they ended up getting an executive director, this woman, Helen Cowder, who happily folded all these new things that we were doing on the side back into the gallery. And eventually they found a space and they're thriving. I mean, I found that all of those ideas that we were doing, all of that experimental stuff, some of it worked, some of it didn't, but it was just, there was such energy around that you could tell the openings were filled with people and everyone was excited and the whole city became excited. And then we did like a whole citywide event, which is, all those things, all that experimentation went back and it informed the practice, it changed them dramatically, and they got huge grants, Andy Warhol grants. So I think that there's certainly room for every kind of practice. I'm not saying that, I really think artists are important and people need to just find their way, and artists need to make a living, and some people need to be in their studio and sell their work. But for me, just personally, I found that was not me. I thought at one point I would just be a photographer in my studio and sell my work, and that just didn't have enough resonance for me. I felt kind of trapped in my studio, and I didn't want to just make something to hang on the wall. So
Yeah.
I am very partial to independent alternative spaces. And I'm so pleased that I found you guys at Compound Yellow. I was really
Yeah.
starting to lose hope, actually.
Yeah, I mean, Laura has always been sort of right at the vanguard of what an art space can be.
Right, right.
I mean, for me as a painter, I find a white cube to be sort of like the ideal place. And when I see a white cube gallery, I just salivate with the open possibility of filling it up. But I also recognize that it's very difficult to put a lot of artwork in just a white cube. It's a very specific design that fits really well for a certain kind of artwork. But when you're talking about pieces, for example, like the nomadic cube or any other relational piece, it's extremely difficult to fit it into there. And I've seen some pieces, and I hate myself for forgetting the name of this artist, but a guy who literally built a cage in which he lived in the gallery in the white cube.
Yes, I met him, Tai Ching Se. He's
Yeah,
Taiwanese.
yeah.
In fact, he agreed to be curated into Due East. Yeah, he let me in. I don't know how I made it in there. I guess he saw me as maybe a kindred spirit. I don't know. But
Yeah.
it was really interesting. And especially right now, his work is really important because, of us being secluded and quarantined.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm still remembering his piece where he tied himself to another person for,
Yeah.
was it like a year or something?
Yeah, he's intense.
Yeah, and it's just it's crazy. I mean, and definitely a white cube is not the way to go for a lot of different artwork.
Right.
I mean, I worked with another gallery here in Oak Park that just, I mean, like you said, with institutions, it's really hard to just change the minds of people on the boards of some galleries. I mean, this gallery didn't even have any awareness of other spaces in Chicago, or didn't care to go to the MCA or the Art Institute to just see what's happening outside of the local Oak Park scene, or get ideas for any future stuff. Getting anything that wasn't like paintings or sculptures was so difficult, and I just hope that they can get their game out there and see what else can be done in their space, because they do have a beautiful space, but
yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for it. I think that the problem often is commerce, right? So you have art as commerce, and then you have art as art, art as experiment, as the way it's really meant to be. I think art as commerce is fine. And there's certainly artists that are making amazing work that should be in a gallery. And I don't see enough of it, but, occasionally when you see an artwork that's, that you love, it's wonderful to see in a white cube. I think, unfortunately, museums have become, like everything else, so commercially driven, so invested in writing grants that talk about, art as an economic driver, doing shows that will bring numbers of people in, and going for sort of the big names, or just to having, maybe being limited. Maybe they want to do more, but maybe they're limited by the board or whatever. But, it seems like there's some places in Chicago I've seen that we're trying to move out of that a bit. Maybe the big ones, it's harder. The smaller ones, maybe a little bit more. But it's interesting that oftentimes I feel like when I've had initial ideas for projects, when I've gone to an art institution, initially I get very similar questions, which is, well, what's the art going to look like? And a lot of my international projects, I have a whole different paradigm. It's all about making work as we go, and the sort of cross-fertilization. That's the whole point. I'm not choosing artworks. We're making it as we go. We're putting two cultures together and exploring together and creating artwork. So the first response is often, well, what's it going to look like? And I'll say, if I knew what it was going to look like, I wouldn't find that very interesting. That's the whole point. I don't really know. I wait and see, and then I sort of curate it as to kind of what happened, right? And the process is just as important as the show. So I have found not like huge reluctance by an institution to take something like that on. They don't want to take the risk, and then they also don't want necessarily a curator who isn't affiliated with, because I'm an independent. They don't. I guess they don't often want to take They don't want to take risks, and they often, at least I found in Chicago, trying to find a space for some of the international projects, they really like to have their own people curating. So as an independent curator, I think it can be very difficult. I'm
Yeah.
sure other independent curators feel the same way. But alternative spaces, the sky's the limit. It's just it's great. It's hard, and a lot of alternative spaces burn out. Which is a whole nother conversation. Why
Yeah.
why they burn out? But yeah, I mean, I think right now that in this climate, alternative spaces are really going to be important for a while. Again, thankfully, it's been like a decade or decade and a half.
Yeah.
Certainly in Chicago, the Hyde Park is doing this show on alternative spaces, and a lot of galleries and museums are closed. So this is a moment for alternative spaces to shine. I think it's going to be really great, actually, for Chicago to at least spotlight alternative spaces for a while and see what percolates, because there are things percolating, and that's really, really exciting. Chicago seemed a lot more conservative to me when I first got here, but now that I've taken a little bit more of a deep dive, I realized there's lots of really interesting people doing interesting things, often under the radar.
Yeah, and I think that, alternative spaces have the advantage that, they have so little funding that they're not beholden to a board that has special interests, and older and bigger institutions have to be held up to the desires of their board or the desires of their potential donors. One example that hits really close to me is my alma mater, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, who recently came out asking its faculty and students not to affiliate the academy with the Black Lives Matter movement, because it would upset potential donors, and it would upset potential board members that would are the lifeblood of the school. And it just ended up being this whole fiasco that that as a school and museum and historical American institution, as old as the United States, is just not coming out in support of a popular and much needed civil rights movement, simply because it's afraid of losing funding. And the advantage of smaller spaces, smaller schools, or smaller artist-run alternative spaces is that, hey, we have a $500 budget and we're 10 people out on a shoestring. We're going to be right at the vanguard. And if we lose the project, we lose the project, but there's a point to be made here,
Right.
Sometimes alternative art spaces are not meant to last more than a year or more than a few years,
Right.
It's kind of like they're, it's okay to fail. It's not the end of the world if your alternative art space is done. You can start a new one next year with a new idea.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's what I've gravitated towards. So, I have tried, I have a bachelor's degree in fine arts, and I've sort of tried to get into the museum scene, and it's been really hard to get a job in museums because they always ask for a master's degree to just an entry-level position in a curatorial team, or just to become the assistant of the curator or something like that. And there's always a lot of glass ceilings, a lot of what's the word? There's a lot of preferential treatment for a special group of people, and to me, alternative art spaces have just been sort of if you want to make art happen, or if you want to curate, or if you want to be part of a program, but you don't want to, or you don't have $300,000 to spend on a master's degree, that's the only option, for a lot of people.
Right. No, absolutely. And the successful museums or galleries are ones that maybe have some space for rebellious thinking, that there's some place. But I think, there's a lot of letters going around to museums about sort of Black Lives Matter and, sort of their policies. And I think that's really important for everyone to be looking at, for sure. But I also feel like, that's sort of, it's a wider problem that needs to be addressed. It's more institutional thinking. Institutional thinking can be really rigid and confining, and for women, for everyone, whether you have a degree or not. And often I think you just kind of have to, I often just trust my intuition. If I'm not feeling comfortable in the space, and often when I'm walking around in sort of the institutional places. I mean, we were at Yale and New Haven, even just walking around University of Chicago. I mean, there are places where I walk around where I think, wow, it'd be great to have a show here, but I don't really feel free and comfortable in certain spaces. And that's now become an indicator to me whether it's a good idea to partner or not. No matter what I think about how great it would be to have a show and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But, I think artists really need to ask themselves, what do they really want? Do they want to grow as artists and be pushed as artists and really thrive? Or do they want to just sort of have a job or a show that makes them look good? Because a lot of times they get that show and they really feel kind of dirty or revolted afterwards. It's not really what they thought it was.
Yeah, and again, sort of like with the ethical consequences of big art institutions or big art events like Art Basel that, has to kick out homeless people from, their dwelling spaces to make the city look nice, quote unquote, for international visitors, or perhaps large museums and large galleries that are funded by, a lot of people in the oil industry that have caused, or companies that have caused oil spills or all that. Or even just,
and even just collectors, a lot of collectors are just being told what to buy. And it's like a scene that's really is very unhealthy.
Yes.
And
yes,
I'm hoping maybe, that one positive thing from the coronavirus pandemic is just it's really gotten people, because we were inside and feeling so vulnerable, to really just rethink their priorities about what's important. And I think things will shift. Certainly museums and galleries, they have a problem right now. So
they do have.
It's an interesting, I think it's a really interesting time. It's a sad and confusing and difficult time, but I also think there's just so much potential in reimagining all of our futures, what the role of all these different kinds of institutions and spaces can be. And certainly artists can lead the way with that.
Yeah, no, and the other thing, is that you, the Nomadic Cube is like part art installation, part roaming art space that, curates itself. Like, you're blending the roles of artist and curator when you make the Nomadic Cube happen in another place. What do you consider your role or yourself as, when the cube is installed? Because obviously it's an art sculpture that functions as an art sculpture, but it's also the space where you bring in people, you curate the events happening in it. How do you see your role when you're working with the Nomadic Cube?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And for the longest time, I thought, am I an artist? Am I a curator? Mm-hmm. Is there a difference? Is there, what ways are they different? In what way is it similar? And I think I have come to realize that I see myself both as an artist and a curator, and maybe it's one and the same, because I realize for all the Nomadic Cube projects, and certainly for, my international projects, there's a visioning that goes on before. It's not just like, I'm going to put this cube here and see what happens, see who wanders in and what happens. So I have a vision for each project. In the past, I've selected each place very carefully. Like there was a cube in Philadelphia called Not a Vacant Lot. It was called Calling Attention to Vacant Lots. And then I curated artists to create a film in an empty lot, to activate the space in some way and make a film about it. And there was another cube installation in Philadelphia called Beyond What Was, where we worked with the homeless population at Liberty Safe House, and we created tintype portraits, and then we made a film about them. And their portraits and their stories were 10 feet high, and it was just really moving listening to the stories. So those are examples where I have a specific vision for what I want to happen. And like in our work, it evolves. So I feel like I'm shaping, like a sculptor, maybe I'm shaping the structure, I'm guiding the process. Yeah. And kind of like working in the dark, the way an artist works, you start and you just let it evolve. And, because I do vision the cube initially and then continue to vision it as it changes, I do see it as an art work. So I wasn't trained as a curator, and maybe that's another reason why I just don't separate the art from the curation, because I'm just not bound by convention. And, I just feel like curators, I think probably the best curators are ones maybe that didn't get formal training, and that they're investigating a lot of new ideas and bringing people together and making new connections like an artist does. And I think more artists are curating these days. And when an artist curates, it's usually more interesting than someone who is just went and had curatorial studies, because a lot of it is just overly conceptual for me. I've heard curators give presentations and I just think like they're just going on and on and on and on. To me, it sounds like, I don't know, verbal masturbation.
No,
it's like entertaining one another with just like, what are you talking about? What does this really matter? I mean, and maybe like any intellectual idea or pursuit, it does matter to the people who are interested in furthering their intellectual capacity about a given subject. I'm just not part of that club. I've always just turned away the second I hear something being overly intellectualized.
Yeah.
I'm not really interested anymore. I mean, unless someone's really brilliant and there's an idea that hasn't been thought of before, I mean, then okay, you got me. But in general, just to kind of go on and on about nothing is, I find that's not my, I'm not.
Yeah,
interested.
no, I always found it weird that, for some curatorial studies, or I mean, a lot of them, you have to have a master's degree in art history, and I'm just like,
Right.
why do I need to know that much about art history to curate about something that's contemporary?
Well, I don't know. Actually, to be said, I actually did study art history in college, and so actually it was really helpful, although only up to a certain time. So I'm older than a lot of artists,
Yeah,
But
and I did,
yeah.
I do have a background partly in art history with my bachelor's degree. I mean, I studied Baroque art, Islamic art, medieval art, and even like, ancient art. I mean, that's where a lot of my interest in ancient Rome comes from. But yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of like, why do I need to know the very specifics of French Impressionism to understand what's going on in the contemporary European art scene? This podcast to me is kind of like is a curatorial practice, because it's about bringing artists in and not just show their artwork to the public, but just get their own practice in, and it's more about listening, more about being receptive to what other people say rather than what you said, just verbal masturbation in a
trying to impress someone. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, everyone's so busy trying to impress each other. It must get so exhausting.
Exactly. Yeah.
I just don't. I never had the patience for that. It's just and I used to be insecure about it. I was like, well, maybe I should have gone to curatorial school, but now at this point it's a little late and I don't really care. It's fine. It's better.
Yeah, better the path of Diogenes than the path of whoever else.
Because then you're not copying. I mean, I really feel like it's there's something really freeing about just sort of going and trying new things and learning as you go, and just not spending your time copying so that you can look good.
Yeah. I mean, what? I mean, you have done the Nomadic Cube. You have done performative art pieces in collaboration with both national and international artists. What advice do you have for new artists trying to organize community spaces or artist-run spaces, or are trying to to place themselves in the vanguard of art? What advice would you give to new artists coming in the scene?
The first thing I would say is it takes a long time to be able to have something to say. So don't worry about that you have something to say or not something to say, or whether you're good enough. Like, don't also be really good to yourself. Learn how to be kind to yourself, because we all spend sort of our early years just being so self-critical, especially women. I mean, probably everyone, so self-critical. Like, I remember I would make a photograph and I'd say, that's terrible, or that's shitty. What is that? Just spent so much time wasted just being self-critical. And often I would actually look back on that work and I thought, actually, I was really onto something, and I stopped before. Maybe I was too fearful to keep going.
That's the worst feeling. As a painter, I've had that where
it's terrible.
I stop midway in a piece because I look at it as like, that's so derivative.
Derivative, right? But the thing is, you have to move. Yeah, you have to move through. You have to just keep going and not be so judgmental, because you don't get it right the first time. It's, actually in the beginning, it isn't. You are maybe copying, or it's not really all that interesting. So, the point is to really have faith in yourself and in the process, and do your own, spend time in self-reflection, and out in the world. Try to expand your horizons and take risks and meet people different than you. And so don't spend all your day in the studio trying to make something. Live your life. find
Yeah.
people that you love, live your life. I really feel like so much of artwork is a mirror of who we are. And
Mhm.
you just want to make sure you're living your life, and later you can maybe find a way to make art that feels like such a part of your life. It's all very fluid.
Right.
I kind of learned that with photography. Initially I was trained as a commercial photographer in New York City. I realized I was making tons of money in New York City, and I learned technique, but then I had to kind of unlearn it because I realized I really didn't want to be a commercial photographer. So I started like photographing on my own, but I was still kind of controlling because I had this technique. It had to look kind of perfect, and I was using
Mhm.
large format and everything. But gradually over time, I learned to let go. I think that, surrender is a really important word. You just like work, but don't hold it too tightly, because that will show in the work. A lot of work
Yeah.
sometimes I'll see work that I really like, but it's tight and it's reflective that the artist is just not, for whatever reason, just like
Yeah.
not letting go, like those Olympic skaters that just throw themselves in the air, when they're performing, and they just have let go, and in such a beautiful way. And that's really important. And a lot of times now I just walk around with my iPhone taking photographs as a sort of meditation. And I've
Right.
just really learned, over the years with meditation or residencies and seeing how other people work in a more joyful way. Like in Iceland, everyone
Mhm.
was interdisciplinary and really joyful, and there was no curator or artist, or they were musicians. They were all doing everything.
Yeah.
um, and that really was a very freeing thing to see. So I would say try to find ways to be joyful no matter what, and don't take yourself too seriously. Put your ego aside when you can.
Mhm.
Not just not you.
That's a hard thing for some artists. I mean, I've met some
We
artists.
all, well,
Yeah.
it's a fine line. You don't want to lose yourself, but you don't want
Yeah.
to just be all about yourself.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I've had some artists that just go on about how good they are, and it's kind of like,
yeah,
oh my God,
yeah,
will you get over yourself?
yeah. I mean, no, I think most people are really insecure. So if they're talking about how good they are, it's coming from an insecure place. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe there's some people. I mean, look, Trump talks about how he's so great, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so you don't want to be like Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what the Dunning-Kruger effect, or something, where people
Right.
that think they're the best at something are usually not that good at it.
Yeah, the most
Um,
brilliant people I know are incredibly modest
yeah,
and know how much they don't know.
yeah, and when you said like resonates, I mean, as a photographer, Cindy Sherman, right?
Right.
I mean, she was quoted for saying, if I knew what the work of art would end up looking as from the start, I wouldn't do it.
Oh yeah. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, that's a brave thing to do, and to know that you got to work. You got to work at what you love. You can't just expect to go in and be brilliant. It's a
yeah,
very long process, and the whole point is the process is really everything. So you just want to make your life meaningful,
yeah.
and so that your
There's
your
so much
short
pressure.
time here is that you've made the best of what you could in the
Yeah,
short time that you
yeah.
were here. So
There's
um,
there's so much expected from young artists. I feel. I mean, I graduated 3 years ago, and it just feels like young artists have or feel this pressure to be successful before you're 35. You know,
yeah,
and or to get gallery representation in some way or another, by the time you're 35, or even before I graduated. I mean, they were sort of asking us to have a very concise and very clear statement about our work, and I'm like, what kind of brutality is that? You're asking a 20-something-year-old to tell you what
it's
their artwork
brutal.
is
That's the
about.
right word. It's brutal.
Exactly,
I think that's more your generation. Like our generation, we were told, "Don't be an artist. You can't make a living." I mean, I don't
yeah,
know what the art schools were saying because I wasn't in art school, but I do see that now. I think it's very very unhealthy what
yeah. There's a
art
lot
schools
of.
are
I
being
mean,
told.
yeah, I mean, the
Yeah,
art world sort of has moved to Instagram, Facebook,
yeah,
YouTube, and
yeah,
you and it's actually very weird. I've been having talks about this with my girlfriend about how there's a lot of artwork being made specifically to be curated on an Instagram profile. So artists have to make artwork that is fast to make. It doesn't take that much effort because it just goes on Instagram,
right.
and is aesthetically pleasing in a way that I can catch your eye within 1 second of scrolling. So it's actually this idea of artist success has created this whole aesthetic, and we we sort of call it like the Instagram aesthetic or something like that, where and I believe it comes from this pressure of like an artist has to have their shit together before they're 35, or or they're
It's
not.
going to be the undoing of artists, and that's why there's so much shitty work around.
Yeah,
even a lot of people aren't even really, they're getting into art schools if they can afford to go. And I mean, I feel like a lot of the actual skill of being an artist isn't even really taught anymore. It's undervalued. It's all about the idea. I remember walking into a Yale graduate student photography open studios, and he was there and his studio was empty. And he was giving me some bullshit thing about emptiness. And I'm thinking to myself, if I was your mother, I would just like grab you by the ear and I would drag you home.
Oh my God, yeah.
Like what? Yeah,
for my I had a printmaking class, an etching class in the Pennsylvania Academy, and I was so annoyed for the final project because one student, all he did was write an essay about why he didn't do the final project, and he pasted it on the wall sideways.
Right.
And I was like, fuck you, man. Like
it's really, I think it'll probably change because everything is changing. I hope so. Because sometimes the pendulum has to swing way over to the extreme before it kind of comes back and in a good way. But yeah, I mean, I think that the art world swung way out of control, including its teaching of art. And I think hopefully, I hope that it will swing back.
Yeah, and I do feel like the swing back is starting with, like we said, alternative art spaces coming in from an upswing where a more intense connection with the public is valued over the commercial value of a piece of artwork that can be sold and made profit of. I think neoliberalism and capitalism sort of bleed into the art world and become part of its rules of engagement. If you're an artist in the art world, you have to be desirable. You have to have you have to sort of have your own cult of personality, your own following. But with alternative art spaces, it's more about the communal value of the artwork, much like it, for example, in the Middle Ages, where sculptures weren't made just by one person. It was an entire studio of people in that community trying to do that, or when they built. I mean, we see churches from the Middle Ages, the Gothic period, or the pre-Renaissance period, or even the Baroque period, where it's you think that it's just a work of one architect and just having a bunch of people build it, but it was actually a multi-generational project of the community. And a lot of people, I learned this in art history actually. In the Middle Ages, towns would compete with each other on who would build the better church. So it was kind of like this whole community project, and the masons would do their best to get the stones cut exactly as they needed to be. And the architects would have like a multi-generational thing in the family where the father was the architect, the son was the architect, and they would go onto the different towns, steal their ideas, come back here. And it was just sort of the artwork, the pictures of the saints, the entryways, the spaces, the columns, every aesthetic experience was this entire communal effort, from everybody in the town to just make that church the pride and the labor of love of everybody around there. And I think that's where we're shifting in now. I mean, sort of what with the nomadic cube, sort of also bringing in everybody from the town together to make an experience that everybody is going to be a part of, and everybody is going to be, that even if it's not a multi-generational effort, or all that. And to end this podcast, can you tell me a little bit more, or can you tell our audience more, like what's the current project that's going to be happening in the Nomadic Cube?
Sure. So right now, as you know, there's a bubblegum pink cube at Compound Yellow
on Lake Street.
And I love the fact that it's right on the street and that the community is such a diverse group of people. So the first project is called Interwoven. And it's an idea that I've been thinking about for a while. It started when I was working on my recent project called Due East in Taiwan, which has been postponed because of COVID until 2022, I should say. it was going to happen in 2020. When I was in Taiwan, I traveled to the East Coast where a lot of the indigenous population of Taiwan lives. And I learned that a lot of young girls learn weaving from a very young age. And so most of the women there are very, very experienced weavers. And one woman that I met, turns out she is a princess in her tribe. She's really amazing, very enigmatic. And she, at one point, and she's a beautiful, very talented weaver. At one point, she did a residency in Paris. She was invited to do a residency in Paris. She went, and that changed her whole thinking about weaving and started thinking of it more in installation terms. Right. And as it turned out, a typhoon destroyed her town. And she ended up collecting clothes from the town. They were put into a temporary camp where they were still living. And she created this unbelievable installation, weaving the fabrics from the people and her loved ones and her friends and family from that town. And it's all interconnected. All the sculpture and the weavings are interconnected. And I thought that was such a beautiful idea. And I had thought with the cube, initially maybe I'd bring the cube to Taiwan and maybe we could do a weaving project there. But her ideas stayed with me, and I thought that it would be really wonderful to start this cube in Chicago with a weaving project, right, similar to her idea of collecting clothes and personal items, maybe even trinkets from the local community that we could work with weavers who are experts, fiber artists. We could all work together in weaving the cube with these items in sort of a metaphorical way or a symbolic way of just sort of weaving the community together. Because I found since I've been in Chicago, it seemed to me that neighborhoods are very separate, maybe because it's so cold most of the time that artists and generally people that I've met have kind of stuck to the confines of their neighborhood. So I love the idea of this as a call to Chicago to just, come together as a community and what better than having sort of the personal items woven together. Maybe we'll do some writing on the clothes, do some workshops in the cube. So that will start soon. As you know, we're kind of getting our act together, and It's a major project because it's a 10 foot by 10 foot cube. But I just thought that would be a really nice way to begin. And then there's a gazillion ideas. I have pages and pages of notes of other possibilities. And what you do is you just kind of find the one that resonates the most and you just dig in there. But right now the idea is that we do something in the summer and the winter, fall, and spring, so 4 seasons, and then just take it from there.
Yeah, and what better way to show the space of communities coming together than being on one of those liminal streets that's really close to the border to another neighborhood here,
right.
Oak Park in Austin, sort of
right.
2 communities that have had a mixed relationship over the period of time they've existed. I mean, Chicago. I read the Devil in the White City, and I really recommend that you read it because it shows the history of Chicago through its architecture and its political life through the 19th century and the early 20th century, but more late 19th century, like the Gilded Age, and it just shows how you have it's been a historically segregated place because it just communities of immigrants stick here, and they're linguistically separated because, for example, Ukrainian village, you have Ukrainian immigrants that don't speak a lick of English, and for them it's really hard to go into the other neighborhoods and interact with other people simply because of a language barrier. And they're even Chicago residents that are born and raised in the Ukrainian village. They're full-blooded Americans or fully legal Americans, but they still have a heavy Ukrainian accent, because they just don't speak English at home. And I do think Chicago is a very good place to start with a nomadic cube to sort of blend in these spaces, especially as we, hopefully soon come out of the coronavirus and sort of see, what we've been, what has been taken out of our lives, this human interaction that we have, lost in the last 6 months or so.
Exactly. Yeah, it was interesting. I know at one point you were curious, like, what were some of the other things that took place in the cube? And, one of the things that I learned a lot from was last summer, I did a series, it was the beginning of the Nomadic Cube in Chicago. And I was still pretty new here. I recently moved from Philadelphia. So I ended up curating 3 different projects in 3 different neighborhoods. And the idea was, okay, I'm just going to try to learn about these neighborhoods. I don't know anything about them, but I found 3 separate artists that I thought would be interesting to work in the cube, and curated them in. And I found it was a huge learning experience for me, because what I learned, and I can explain why, is that because I felt it was unsuccessful in some ways. Right. Successful in some ways and very unsuccessful in other ways. What the unsuccessful part of them was that I learned that you can't just go into a neighborhood with a cube and expect to do something interesting, that you have to spend time and go deep. Like the other places I'd had the cube, I'd lived there for years, 17 years. I knew everybody. I knew the artistic community. I knew the neighborhoods. I knew the homeless people. They were my friends, et cetera, et cetera. Same in New Haven. But Chicago, because I was working on international projects, I made the mistake of thinking, all right, I'm just going to find a neighborhood. I'm going to go in and we're going to do these projects and they're going to be great, right? But what I found was that they need time to evolve. The relationship with the artist, my relationship with the artist participating, has to be evolve and get to a point where we really trust and understand each other, so that we can collaborate effectively. Right. And that I needed to take my time. But instead, the 3 interventions that I did had to be rushed because I had a small time period. They had to have security because they were in difficult spaces.
And that's that always,
yeah. The cube was vandalized. The security guy left in the middle of the night because he got bored, and then the cube was vandalized. There were moments of magic, which there always are in these projects, but they were few. And in the end, I was really drained and I was ready to throw away the cube, literally ready. I'd like to not store it anymore and throw it away. So what the three spaces were, there was one, I'll just briefly, one was at 18th and Paulina in Pilsen. It was titled Here. And I worked with Joseph Mora and Sarita Garcia from Undocumented Projects. Joseph is a DACA dreamer. And
Same here.
Oh, really? I didn't know that about you. Okay, well, you'll be interested in this then. We had an anonymous recording booth in the cube, and passerbys were invited to speak out on issues of immigration. It was right in a plaza in Pilsen, and outputting their voices through the speaker to the street. And so it was a confession-like booth where you could be anonymous. You sort of went in under this black velvet, and they could speak freely. And the problem there was we were right in the middle of the ICE raids in Chicago.
Ooh,
and most people were freaked out that we were doing this. They did not want to, even though they could speak anonymously, they still had to walk in. We were filming them because we were planning on projecting the films, not the people, but the films of their legs and the booth and everything, and their voices. Some people did, but most people just ran as far away from this. Yeah. So that was a learning experience. The second place was at 34th and Halsted in Bridgeport, and Santiago X, who's an indigenous futurist artist, very cool guy who I'd met at the Art Institute, created this really interesting hut similar to what he later constructed at the Chicago Architectural Biennial a few months later. So he and Chi Nations Youth Council gathered invasive non-indigenous grasses harvested from Chicago city streets and earth from sovereign tribal lands. And then we all thatched the hut together. This hut was incredible. It was really beautiful. It was vandalized, unfortunately, but we put it back together. The space was very problematic. There were attics in the space. It was right next to a library. And the manager there was going on and on about how much he hated his job and he hated the people in the park. And I was like, no, it'll be fine. And I thought I'd made friends with the guys there and they were so charming. And then one of them said he'd watch the cube. And then another one said he wanted the cube at the end. And we had this whole thing. We brought it to his yard, and he was part Native American, and he was so happy. Well, in the end, it was just a disaster. And the guy that we gave the cube to, it turned out, threw the cube into this beautiful hut, like a spiritual, beautiful hut, into the parking lot. And I had to go pay $400 to get it out of there. And it was just a mess. I never even told Santiago about this. I didn't have the heart, so hopefully you won't hear this podcast. And he went on to bigger and better things in his mind, which is the architectural biennial. But in my mind, this was much more interesting because it was in a problematic space, and we dealt with all the things, and that was part of it. Is whatever happened, and it was pretty interesting actually, but it was difficult. It was really difficult. And then the third place was in Chatham Plaza. My friend Aaron Evans, who's a trumpet player and actor, we just got together with him and these musicians, and it was just this really fun sort of flash mob kind of improv piece where people on the street thought these people had just come together, and they pulled out their instruments and everybody was like singing and dancing, and that was fun. But again, I had just set foot in Chatham, I had just set foot in Bridgeport, I just set foot in Pilsen, and honestly, they're all really interesting spaces. But I think what's beautiful about or reassuring to me about being at Compound Yellow is that it's a very loving space. Laura is such an exceptional director and person, and I have found the people that are drawn into that space are so wonderful. And so it's really nice for the Cube to be in such a loving home and environment. And I really am grateful that it's there, and that it will really make, because it's already in a safe space, it will make whatever we're doing go a lot more smoothly. It'll be, I think we can sort of, it'll allow for a little bit more magic, because we won't be in crisis all the time about our safety or our mental well-being. Or, it's easier to surrender when you feel safe. So
exactly.
I'm really looking forward to working with all of you and see what happens.
Yeah, we have an exciting several months ahead of us.
We do. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, no, and I want to encourage all the audience hearing right now to check out our website, compoundyellow.com, and check us out on Facebook, see what's going to be happening with the Cube, because it really is going to be a very exciting few months where we don't know. I mean, that's the thing. We just don't know what's going to happen. Anything could happen, and we will take any ideas coming from anybody here. If the idea is good, we'll take it.
And also, if you're listening, if you're a weaver, let us know. We would love to have you come weave with us. Yes. I'm sure they're fiber artists. I don't know who they are, but I'm sure you all are out there. If you're a fiber artist, or if you want to come weave with us, or if you've had weaving experience of large installations, please, we would love for you to come join us.
Yes, you can email us at info@compoundyellow.com if you are a fiber graduate from the SAIC, or you're coming in Chicago, you have some experience with weaving or fiber artwork. You can contact us, again, info@compoundyellow.com, and we'll be more than happy to put you into the projects that we're doing. We're very excited to have you here. And I think with that, that's a wrap.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
That was really fun.
Yeah, no, I mean, doing a podcast is fun. It's like I hope it becomes the next great American hobby.
I think it is at the moment. It is at the moment. But you know what, Gabe? You're really good at it. You really. I mean, Laura's right. You're a natural. It's just I'm so happy. I know you have a lot of things that you excel at, and it's really nice to see that you've sort of taken up this sort of interdisciplinary process yourself, and because they all influence each other. Everything you do influences the next thing, right?
Yeah, so, exactly. That's
you. I have a lot of admiration. I have a lot of admiration for you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really admire all the things you've done. I mean, obviously we can't put it into just an hour and a half, but you have given us such a good tour about how your life has shaped the Nomadic Cube, all these elements that have come into the practice, and I hope people can learn from it. I hope younger artists listen to this and come up with a wider perspective on what their art practice can be,
Right. We need new paradigms for sure.
Yes, definitely. Several new paradigms. So I'm going to leave you here. Thank you so much for coming in. And our audience can email us, can contact us, and I will see you on Wednesday, hopefully.
Friday.
Yeah, Friday. Friday. Yeah. So I'll see you later.
All right. Bye-bye.